The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
the Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida. For nearly a century and a half, the Ponce Inlet Lighthouse has stood sentinel as a silent witness to history, from post-Civil War Reconstruction to early tourism and racing on the beach to America's first manned missions into space. The lighthouse beacon has helped countless ships at sea safely navigate Florida's coast and guided shipwreck survivors safely to shore. Strategically located between the lighthouses in St. Augustine and Cape Canaveral, the Ponce Inlet Lighthouse was completed in 1887. Standing at 176 feet 6.5 inches, Ponce Inlet Lighthouse is the tallest in Florida and one of the tallest in the United States. Welcome to Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. I'm Ben Brotmarkle. Ponce Inlet Lighthouse was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1972 and was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1998.
In the 1830s, of course, you had maritime commerce was increasing along the Florida coast, and so they determined that a need for a new beacon here at what was once called Mosquito Inlet was needed. And so the U.S. government, the U.S. Lighthouse Establishment, essentially contracted with Winslow Lewis, who was a well-known lighthouse builder, to erect a tower here on the south side of the inlet. And so he agreed to do that, and using kind of a set of standardized plans, erected a 45-foot tall white conical brick lighthouse along with the keeper's dwelling. And that was completed back in 1835.
Winslow Lewis had a sort of a sweetheart contract with the then Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, who was responsible for American lighthouses. Lewis did lighthouses from New England all the way down here to Florida, and of course our 1835 lighthouse was one of Lewis's mistakes.
So the 1835 lighthouse was not particularly well built. It was built on top of a sandbar. It was, the foundations weren't very solid, and so within a couple months of it being constructed, a big storm came and dislodged a bit of the foundation, just made it very complicated to remain standing.
William H. Williams, who was descendant of Florida pioneers, William H. Williams, who was his uncle, and Samuel Williams, who was his father, who settled locally in this area, was given the job as the first lighthouse keeper. And he moved here with his family in 1835, and shortly thereafter he was called away to serve on jury duty in St. Augustine. And while he was gone, a storm came through the inlet and severely damaged the tower to the extent that it washed the keeper's house away. His wife and children actually had to evacuate their residence and take refuge in a house that was to the south, that was on higher ground. And when Williams came back, he saw that the damage was pretty extensive, so he temporarily moved his family back to St. Augustine to live with his mother. In December, the Second Seminole War started up, and so Kawakachi, or the Wildcat, along with a band of Seminole warriors. That was at the period where most of the sugar plantations along the Halifax and Indian River were destroyed. And in the process of that, they attempted to destroy the lighthouse as well, tried to set fire to the tower, to the wooden steps on the interior, but the wood was still so green it wouldn't burn. So instead, they basically ransacked the station, and according to legend, Quacachia actually stole one of the reflectors from the Winslow Lewis lighting apparatus that was used at the top of the tower.
The Second Seminole War started, and nobody's going to come out here to, fix a lighthouse while there's a war going on and raids happening. So it just kind of stayed there until a couple months later when it just collapsed into the sea.
It was built probably without a foundation, in sand. It suffered about 4 severe storms, plus a little bit of a problem with the beginning of the Second Seminole War, in that it was a very attractive nuisance for the Seminoles, and they raided it, broke all the glass in the windows, tried to set fire to it. Unfortunately, it succumbed, or maybe fortunately, it succumbed in April of 1836 to a final storm which took it out.
During the Seminole War, they were unable to repair. They were unable to, do anything to be able to keep it in good condition. It was never lit, and it eventually fell into the water.
They did cause quite a bit of destruction along the sugar plantations that were located here, including the Dunlawton Plantation, Bulow Plantation, New Smyrna Beach Plantation, DeMott Plantation, things of that nature. So it was quite extensive, and essentially for white settlers for quite some time it was not a safe place to be.
After the original 1835 lighthouse had fallen, we went 50 years without a lighthouse at all, but the people that lived in the area still wanted a lighthouse. They needed a lighthouse. It's a very dangerous area, very dangerous inlet to be able to do their trade and the boating and all of that. So they were petitioning, trying to get another one. The Civil War happened. It really slowed down everything. So coming out of that, there was a big push in the 1870s again to get a lighthouse placed here. I mean, we've actually seen records of politicians making promises in the 1870s to try to get a lighthouse built here. And finally, the construction began in 1883 here at Mosquito Inlet.
The original lighthouse, 1835, crashed into the ocean pretty soon thereafter. Then the Second Seminole War happened, Third Seminole War, then the Civil War in the 1860s. And throughout that whole time, there still was a need for a lighthouse in this area, in this inlet. It was a very treacherous inlet, Mosquito Inlet was. So there were lots of requests by lots of the local plantation owners and some of the people that lived around here for a lighthouse to be built. And finally, in the 1880s, that their petition was heard, and you get the appropriations for the construction of a lighthouse over here in 1883. They started getting funds for it, and it was passed in Congress. And then throughout 84, 85, 86, 87, there was the construction of the lighthouse, and then it was first lit in 87, where it still stands today.
In the early 1880s, they determined that a beacon was needed between St. Augustine, which is approximately 45 miles to the north, and Cape Canaveral Lighthouse, which is about 45 miles to the south. And so they determined to rebuild a tower here at what was then called Mosquito Inlet, and they built it on the north side of the inlet this time in its current location.
From the 1850s on, the Army Corps of Engineers began to engineer and also supervise the construction of lighthouses in the United States.
The U.S. Lighthouse Board, which took over essentially the lighthouse service in the 1850s, they commenced to building tall, conical towers, which a lot of times we call them brick giants. And they had built many of those, up until the 1880s. And kind of what makes our tower unique is it's really the culmination of all the research and development, trial and error, essentially experimentation with new materials, new building techniques. And this tower kind of represents the culmination of all that knowledge the Lighthouse Board had accumulated over that 30-year period.
It was constructed pretty much entirely out of brick along the outside. It's been estimated that there's about 1.25 million bricks, mostly bricks that came from around the New York, Baltimore area. And then the center, on the inside of all that brick, there is a cast iron staircase, and that came from Philadelphia. But a lot of people are surprised to find out that even the foundation and everything, it's all brick. There's no metal or anything. The walls, it's just an iron staircase and then brick all over until you get to the very top where you have an iron lantern room as well.
We sort of had The need for a very, very tall tower. Our shipping lanes are pretty far out to avoid sandbars that stretch out from the east coast of Florida quite a ways. So, of course, you need a tall tower, and that's what was built here.
During construction, there was temporary buildings put up. The foundation was laid, the bricks were brought in. General Babcock was the engineer. He never saw the beginnings of it even. He drowned in our inlet trying to get here to do the construction, but it was finally completed in 1887 after a short work stoppage.
Very slowly built, lots of mishaps during the construction. There were lots of shipments of bricks that, because of the treacherous Mosquito Inlet waters, these ships would run aground over here in the inland, and so you'd lose a whole, couple 100,000 bricks, and they'd have to go and reappropriate some more bricks and send a new shipment, and lots of accidents happened. And they needed more funding, and so you could see how it would take so long. And this place being called Mosquito Inlet, there was also nobody wanted to work in summer because of all the mosquitoes around. It was a lot better to work during the winters where it wasn't as bad and there weren't as many malaria spikes. But finally, it did finish construction in 1887, and it has stood here ever since.
Up until that point, conical towers of this size were built using a scaffolding system. So as the tower rose, so did the scaffolding. This tower was different. It used what was called a walking platform, which is essentially kind of a flat donut that as the tower was built, this ring around the tower was winched up, say 6 feet, and then would be wedged back in, and then the workers would build the next feet of the tower, and then the ring would be raised again. And it basically just walked up the tower as it went. Which makes it very unique as well in terms of lighthouses. And that particular technique became kind of the standard from that point forward for making any tall conical towers, including smokestacks and other lighthouses and things of that nature. So it's one of the main reasons we're a National Historic Landmark.
William Rolinski was indeed the first lighthouse keeper here at the Ponce Inlet Lighthouse, which was then the Mosquito Inlet Lighthouse. He was a Russian immigrant, fought in the Civil War. He was a very by-the-books character, is the way that I've seen him described many times. He was good at his job, but he rubbed some people the wrong way.
He was kind of the person that you either liked or disliked. I don't think there's a whole lot of middle ground when it came to Rolinski. But he was pretty efficient. There was conflicts between him and the other assistant keepers that were here, and eventually he was transferred to another light station, and then Thomas O'Hagan, who was a Scottish immigrant, took over some years later.
Rolinski was a very, very good keeper. So good, in fact, that when he was appointed here, he ran into trouble with some of his assistant keepers who weren't quite up to the mark as Rolinski. He was very much a guy who ran it by the book.
He was at other lighthouses prior and was assigned here as our principal keeper. He was the one that lit the initial beacon November 1st, 1887. He and his wife, as well as his family, lived here on the site. His daughter Bertha actually married into the Passetti family across the way, and he was here for a time until the 1890s. He was here for a few years, and then he ended up being put up at another lighthouse, and he and a second principal keeper had switched locations.
Thomas O'Hagan, a very colorful character. He eventually ended up with 13 kids. Many of them lived in this house that we're sitting in here, which is the principal keeper's dwelling. He was from a family of lighthouse keepers. Several of his sons became lighthouse keepers themselves. And he served here for many, many years.
O'Hagan's family was very large. He had 12 children, 11 on site here with him. They lived in our principal keeper house, which was small. His wife was a firecracker, Julia O'Hagan. And we have great stories of the O'Hagan family, their children, their eldest son, Billy O'Hagan, and things that he would get into.
O'Hagan is well known in our lighthouse for having had the most children, right, out of any of the keepers. When he first came to the lighthouse, he had 4 children. He had another 7 while he was living here at the Ponce Inlet Lighthouse, and then had 1 more after, for a total of 12. So we always talk about how he had 11 kids in a little house with around 3 bedrooms. It must have been a handful. But O'Hagan was very good at his job. He was a good keeper. He got many awards for being outstanding and making sure that the lighthouse was running properly, that the light station was very tidy and neat and organized. So anytime there was a lighthouse inspector that would come, everything was always great with O'Hagan.
All of his logbooks, Mrs. O'Hagan wrote in his logs. He claimed it was because his handwriting was terrible. It might have been that he lacked the education necessary to be able to to write. He was a Brooklyn-born boy. He was not an immigrant, second generation, born in Brooklyn, I believe, in 1850.
Stephen Crane became a famous writer in 1895 when his novel about the American Civil War called The Red Badge of Courage was published. The following year, he agreed to work as a journalist covering the war in Cuba. Crane was on his way to Cuba aboard the SS Commodore when the ship sank 12 miles off of Daytona Beach. It was the beacon from what is now the Ponce Inlet Lighthouse that guided Crane to shore and resulted in his popular short story, The Open Boat.
It really struck a chord, of course, with Americans because it was very reminiscent of our own revolutionary story. And so there was a lot of support throughout the United States for the Cuban movement, for the peasants essentially that were being treated quite poorly, really no better than slaves in some cases, by the Spanish government. And these Cuban rebels, they were fighting for their independence. Of course, this made great news, and so Stephen Crane was hired to essentially serve as an embedded reporter, sort of like we saw during the Gulf War.
Of course, back then, we don't have 24/7 cable news, and so the premier communications device was the newspaper. Crane was, of course, a gifted novelist and short story writer, but his day job was a reporter. Well, add all those things together, and Crane gets himself in trouble in New York, which is not unusual. He testifies against a police captain in New York, and so he skedaddles with his newspaper's assent, obviously, down here and goes to Jacksonville to try to find himself a filibustering expedition that he can sign on.
In many cases, they used ships that were within Florida. One of those ships was the steamship, the Commodore, which was a steam tug that was based out of Jacksonville. Stephen Crane reported on board as an able seaman and took a job coming down and was really kind of reporting on the entire process of not only raising funds but also resupplying the Cuban rebels with arms, ammunition, medical supplies, general supplies, food stores, new recruits for the fighting itself. And so they set sail from Jacksonville.
Commodore runs aground twice going out of Jacksonville. It is not sabotage, it is a drunken river pilot. She gets down to about 14 miles off the coast here, and she starts to take on serious water.
The tugboat actually ran aground on a sandbar as it was leaving Jacksonville. And probably that's where the damage occurred, but as the ship made its way to sea, they found that it was taking on water. By the time it made the essentially 90-mile journey from Jacksonville down to approximately where we're at now, just off the coast of Daytona Beach, the ship had taken on so much water that it was sinking.
The last lifeboat is actually the captain's dinghy. 4 men get in, the captain, Crane, the cook, and an oiler from the ship, and they begin the 31.5-hour ordeal that is called, in Crane's short story, The Open Boat.
Of course, the seas were quite rough at that particular point in time, and they spent the next day essentially trying to make it ashore in this open boat. And it's quite a terrifying journey. And one of the things the captain said while they were trying to make it to shore was to keep the eye on the beacon at Mosquito Inlet, which they could see on the horizon. And so that's what they rowed toward, was the beacon at the top of our lighthouse. And eventually they did make it to shore, not without casualties, but Stephen Crane survived. And he then wrote an article about his experience and then turned that article into a short story called The Open Boat, which has been essentially considered by many literary experts as one of the finest short stories written in the English language.
The 1920s were a period of change in the Ponce Inlet Lighthouse, which was still the Mosquito Inlet Lighthouse back then. So it changed names, it got indoor plumbing, it got electricity in the form of generators. So the lantern itself at the top of the lighthouse was still a lantern, right? It was not electrified until 1933, but the buildings where the keepers and their families lived did get some electricity via generators. That would have been absolutely incredible.
Edward Meyer was our last principal keeper, and at the beginning of World War II, in 1942, I believe he joined the Coast Guard.
By 1939, the time had kind of come in order to save costs and kind of streamline government operations. Essentially, the U.S. Coast Guard absorbed all the duties of the U.S. Lighthouse Service. And that's when Myers was serving as principal keeper here. Now, all the lighthouse keepers, of course, it was a job that required expertise and experience and things of that nature that the Coast Guard lacked. And so they kind of offered lighthouse keepers the opportunity to either retire or to basically just enlist in the U.S. Coast Guard, maintaining equivalent rank and things of that nature. And so Myers chose to do that. And so in 1939, he went from being the principal keeper of the lighthouse under the U.S. Lighthouse Service to being the officer in charge of the lighthouse under the U.S. Coast Guard. And he continued to serve in that function here at the lighthouse through the early days of World War II as well.
Of course, at the beginning of World War II, the families at all lighthouses along the Atlantic and Pacific coast were moved off the stations, and so they became bachelor keepers or bachelor quarters, so to speak.
From 1952 up until 1972, we had that 20-year period where the facility was simply not being maintained very well. Also, site security decreased quite a bit as well, to the point where you had vandals coming in, destroying things. There's talk of vagrants living here at the site, of teenagers breaking into the tower, lighting fires in the counterweight well at the base of the tower, going to the top of the tower out on the gallery deck, and wrenching pieces of rusted iron off the gallery deck, pieces of railing, and throwing them into the roofs of the keepers' dwellings below, smashing windows, things of that nature, and then just general rot that occurs from being left out in the elements and not being maintained. So that 20-year period, the condition of the light station really deteriorated very quickly, to the point where by 1972, the very survival of the tower was in question.
There were some residents nearby, such as Gladys Meyer Davis, who was a daughter of a lighthouse keeper here. There was Ann Kinnear, who lived at the next door Passetti Hotel. There was Ayers Davies, who was actually the first mayor of Ponce Inlet. So a lot of these local residents who saw the lighthouse every single day, they felt bad that it was falling into disrepair and was eventually going to probably fall on its own. So they formed the Ponce Inlet Lighthouse Preservation Association in order to preserve this lighthouse.
We are having constant tours. We have lots of school groups. Our education department is tailored towards the K through 12 schools. Everything is offered free of charge to all of the Volusia County school system. We base everything off of the standards set by the state and passed down. We've done lots of outreach for adult education. We've given seminars and symposiums at history events, at docent conventions, everything all across the country. And our department takes pride in leading the way in innovating and presenting historical, social, maritime education to everyone.
Today, the Ponce de Leon Inlet Lighthouse Preservation Association maintains the lighthouse as an operational private aid to navigation and preserves the original 19th century buildings on the site as a museum complex. You've been watching Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. Visit us anytime online at myfloridahistory.org. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ben Brotmarkle. The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
the Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida.